Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience. I'm Deborah Crone, professor of early modern cultural history and chair of academic programs here at BGC. Before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about where you are. You're at Bard Graduate Center, where we study the human past and cultural history through their material traces and the complex ways in which decorative arts, design, and material culture mediate our own relationships with the past and the present. Our graduate students, faculty, and research fellows do this work cognizant of our own location in time and space. We're situated in three landmark buildings on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in the heart of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape people. We're 1 block away from the former site of Seneca Village, a community of African American and immigrant property owners that was forcibly relocated to create Central Park. We're in a neighborhood and a city long comprised of global migrants and refugees from war, violence, and economic dislocation. We're here tonight for a conversation between two people who need no introduction, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction anyway, because that's what we do here. Caroline Fowler is star director of the research and academic program at the Clark Institute. She's written a couple of other books besides the one that we're here to discuss this evening. The Art of Paper, From the Holy Land to the Americas, published by Yale in 2019, and Drawing in the Senses, published by Harvey Miller Series in Baroque Art in 2017. She does a lot of other things, including co-editing the series artwork with Princeton University Press, along with our colleague Itai Weinrib, who's here in the audience, and also hosts a podcast in the foreground, Conversations about Art and Writing. So this evening she is in dialogue with Helga Davis, who's a vocalist and performance artist who performs in many places around the world. She was the principal actor in the 25th anniversary of the international revival of Robert Wilson and Philip Glass's opera Einstein on the Beach. In 2024, she was commissioned by the Onassis Foundation as part of the Cavafy Festival, and she will present a new work in 2025 for the 10-year anniversary of National Sawdust. She is host of the eponymous podcast Helga on WQXR, which many of you probably know, winner of the 2019 Greenfield Prize in Composition, and 2018 to 2021 visiting curator for the performing arts at Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. So, with no further ado, Helga and Caro.
Good evening, everyone. We see you, but we're going to talk to each other. Hello.
Hi, Helga.
One thing I think is interesting and kind of dull is that authors get asked all the time the question, so what was your inspiration for writing this book? And what interests you about this? And I actually think another thing also happens, which is that work calls you.
Yeah.
And so my first question to you is why did this book call you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just trying to think where to start. So the project started 15 years ago, and I was a graduate student living in Amsterdam, and I was taken by this collection of drawings in the Maritime Museum that were really unusual for the period I work on, 17th century. They were these very bare renditions of the West African coastline and surrounding islands. And they were barely delineated in kind of gray wash. And they were tracking clouds and the ways in which clouds moved across the islands. And they were just very unusual. And I wanted to write about them and I wanted to think about them. And at the same time that I wanted to think about those, I also started thinking about Dutch maritime painting. And I was thinking about how the surface is so smooth. It's often kind of this free, the surface made for free trade, this kind of idea of frictionless service along which these ships move. And I was really interested in thinking about how that created certain mythologies about oceanic space that we still live with today. So these two things kind of came together at the same time for me intellectually. And I started reading a lot of legal theory and thinking about how this international space of trade developed. But then I found that that this space had really been deeply theorized most recently by people working within the African diaspora, scholars and poets who really countered this legal tradition in which it was argued that the ocean was an ahistorical space of infinite resource and said, no, this is a place of history. So that's really where the book came about.
That's where the book came about. But where did you come about in relationship to it? So I think that uh, there's a way in which a musician plays a note,
Yeah,
or a way in which a singer hears a song and the song sings them.
yeah,
And so I'm really interested in why this particular. So you've talked about where you were,
yeah,
what you were thinking about, what your inspiration was, but still something in this had to call to you
yeah,
in order to write it and to spend 15 years thinking about it
yeah,
and committing to it.
yeah. It was the Lucille Clifton poem that I start out with. It was I heard it first on a podcast. This podcast, Poetry Unbound. It was cited, but it was the line, why is there always another poem under this poem? And it's been described as an anti-pastoral poem. And she's standing at the shore of the Chesapeake, and she's asking, why can't I write these poems about clouds and skies, because there's always this other poem. And for me, that was the calling, because though that line articulated what I was trying, it was articulating something that was bothering me in the field of art history, which is that I felt like this early modern period and this history of the transatlantic slave trade was always told through really direct, kind of evidential representations, that we had to see the evidence in the painting. And I just felt like there's something wrong here with us demanding this evidential record. And when I heard that poem, I thought that's it. I want to write about that other poem that exists, but that we can't always see.
Will you say a little bit about the interior life of those who benefited from that transatlantic crossing? One of the things that you write about that I love has to do with the benefit of the interior life of the women in particular who benefited from the men who went out exploring.
Yeah,
And part of what they had in their lives and in their homes were the spoils of those travels. But there are also so many representations of maps
yeah,
of the future of conquering worlds, the future worlds of trinkets, of and that those things allowed an interior life when also those women were enslaved by those interior lives. I think that we usually think about the relationship between the Atlantic, between ourselves or our country and slavery as a one-way thing. There was an enslaver and there were enslaved people. And it is my feeling that you cannot, our fingerprints are everywhere on everything. And you cannot be an enslaver without also being enslaved, because you are enslaved to a way of seeing people, of dealing with people, of dealing with yourself, of casting yourself in a particular way. So, will you talk about the interiority of the lives of women in particular who both benefited from and were captured inside this world of exploration?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so maybe just to ground myself a little bit, I'll pull out and say, many of these paintings that Helga that you're talking about are kind of canonically those Vermeer interiors, and those scenes of women kind of reading love letters or pouring milk from a pitcher. And indeed, for a long time, scholars have written about those paintings, kind of tracing the material goods and showing, this came from this place and this is about this global trade. But yeah, what I was interested in is how interiority becomes a commodity in this period. And and this was the hardest chapter for me to write, because it was also, as you know, it's a chapter about abortion. It's a chapter about privacy, and I was trying to figure out a way to understand how privacy could be the means by which women gained the right to abortion in the 1970s, which they then lost. And there's so much literature around Vermeer and privacy and interiority. And I started thinking about how um, how these representations of privacy were really just a commodity. They were an invention. That these women's interior worlds were an invention to be bought and sold, and that in many ways they were an invention to be bought and sold as representations of how great Netherlands was, because they had these beautiful domestic spaces, and these women were kind of these embodiments of the patriotism of that period that was emerging. So yeah, I wanted to show how these paintings, it's both that these women's obviously are these early consumers, or these, the large part of my book is about the rise of the middle class, and how the rise of the middle class and these kind of fantasies about the rise of the middle class and free trade and an art market and secularism and are cannot be disentangled from the violence of global capital. But these I wanted to talk about how these women's lives were integrated within and were part of the lives of women elsewhere in the world, and that these particular Vermeer's women cannot be understood as separate from the enslaved women on the plantations in Suriname and in Brazil, and that their lives were intertangled in complicated ways that is not always visible. And it's both about the consumption of the goods, but it's also about the ways in which there's a manufacturing of an idea of what interiority is that can be consumed and sold, and that there's a manufacturing of the idea of privacy that is very limited.
I think about this negation of the relationship to the plantation specifically. I was in a show once in Charleston, South Carolina, and a friend of mine and I decided that we were going to visit a plantation. We wanted we wanted to have the experience of understanding, in as much as we could, which is very little, what it meant to occupy all of the spaces on
Yeah,
the plantation. And so we were looking in the hotel at at all of the brochures for the tours of the
yeah,
plantations, which is already a thing. And we couldn't find one brochure that used the word plantation.
Wow.
Everyone kept talking about the gardens. The gardens. And so we decided to go. And we got a map and we saw that there was a slave burial ground. And we wanted to go and honor our people.
Yeah.
And so but first we took the tour. And the thing that was so odd is that the person giving the tour kept talking about the workers.
Wow.
I wish it were really funny,
Yeah.
but I can't not laugh also. So she kept talking about the workers and how this chest came from England and that the workers brought it from the port at blah blah, and they walked it through the market, which we were also told was not a slave market, which clearly it was.
Yeah.
And that there was this absence of even the conversation about what was happening
Yeah.
there. We found eventually the graves, and the tombstones were against a building,
Yeah.
and they were completely overgrown. And we kept walking past. So, you have the map, you have
Yeah.
the way, and still you can't find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And then we realized that they were overgrown. And so we literally, without thinking, without talking, we dropped to our knees and we began to pull the weeds out and away from these tombstones.
Yeah.
We couldn't read the names, but we did sit there and weep and say thank you and all of the things. And to imagine that this place is a place now where tours are given. I have to read this to you. This is a review of the same. It's the Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. Touring the house and plantation was a treat. The families and current workers have maintained the feel of all the different areas. The guides were all extremely knowledgeable, and it didn't feel rushed at all. Walking the garden paths, one could imagine the antebellum strolls taken there. A very lovely day.
Yeah.
And so I would love for you to speak a bit about the relationship between nature
Mm.
and how nature was also used as a way of justifying, of living with the plantation system.
Yeah. That's the question that I find sometimes when you finish a project, you realize what one of the main questions was. And when I was writing the conclusion, I realized that the commodification of life is inseparable from the commodification of nature, that the commodification of human lives is inseparable from that. And I um yeah, I mean there's so many places in which this book touches on it. I mean I'll talk about two. One is I think that there's a tendency within those 17th century paintings of plantations by artists like Franz Post, in which the descriptions of the paintings are often a lot like that TripAdvisor. I imagine this like a TripAdvisor review. Are often, the language is very similar to those reviews. Beautiful pastoral setting. Great attention to detail, and such a lovely painting. High price at auction. And usually people say, oh well, they erased the violence, and I actually think I actually think, at least for 17th century viewers and a lot of 18th century viewers, I actually think the violence was part of it. I think that the knowledge of the violence and the ways in which the knowledge of that violence traveled beside the painting was actually cannot be so easily disentangled from the aesthetic pleasure that they took in the painting.
Hmm.
And I think that that's actually the damning part. And that gets me a little bit to the second part where nature really came in for me, which was with Derek Walcott at the end. And the end of the book is the poem The Prodigal, and really kind of going through it and the ways in which Walcott is thinking through Dutch painting and his own relationship with it. But he ends the poem in the middle of the ocean, and he has this beautiful image of these bronze dolphins, because if you travel throughout Europe, you see kind of bronze monumental dolphins everywhere, and Walcott picks up on that, and he ends the poem with this gorgeous image of these dolphins at sea kind of gunning towards the horizon. And I feel like there's this way within Walcott for his poetry often in which he and a friend of mine says that he thinks he can never quite do it, but that Walcott kind of tries to turn to the natural world as a way to offer another existence in the history that he's always grappling with, and one that travels along and beside and within, but is also distinct from. And in this image of kind of dolphins gunning towards the horizon, he's trying to find that other nature. I think he's asking if that other nature can be there, a nature that is not like the nature that Lucille Clifton articulates, in which there's always another poem. I think that at the end, Walcott is trying to say maybe there can be a poem that is separate from this history, or that is not touched by this history. And I don't know if he knows if he ever finds it or if it's possible. I think it's a question he asks. But I think, I mean, what I'm working on now and what I'm thinking about now, and the question that I'm thinking about now, is if it's possible to even see the natural world without this history of property. And I don't know. That's the question.
Will you speak a little bit about Maria? Will you pronounce her name? I
Sibylla
haven't had a
Marion.
chance to confirm with you the
No.
pronunciation of the names.
Maria Sibylla Marion.
The naturalist.
Yeah. So traveled to Suriname. And she's usually celebrated as this really extraordinary woman artist. And she is an extraordinary woman artist. She really went on her own dime. She went to Suriname to study butterflies.
Sorry.
As one would. Um, but
But eventually she is seen as someone, as an artist who is complicit in maintaining the poem.
exactly.
Okay.
And so that's what interests me about her, is the ways in which she's always celebrated, and still to this, I mean, I always see on kind of, you know, feeds, blue sky feeds, people are like, art her story, Maria Silva Marion on this day. Um, and and yet I think what actually makes her work so interesting is her complicitness within the plantation economy. And so, while she was in Suriname, and a lot of people have worked on this, she was dependent on indigenous and enslaved workers and laborers, both for the gathering of her materials, for their knowledge. Her work really couldn't have been written without their knowledge. They're, really never credited. It is known that she likely traveled back to Amsterdam with an indigenous woman with her. But she does have this very interesting passage in which she acknowledges that the indigenous and enslaved women with whom she's surrounded, often use a certain plant to give themselves abortions so that their children aren't born into slavery. And and for me this was very interesting because her entire book is about reproduction. Her entire book is about the reproduction of butterflies and insects and all sorts of, you know, animals and creatures, and she's writes about reproduction. So it seems natural to me that she would notice this abnormality within the world of humans around reproduction, and that she would comment on it. Um, and and so I think that her work on reproduction and her work on the, because also at this period people studied insect reproduction to understand human reproduction, which again seems kind of odd, but that's where we were in the 17th century science, in early 18th century. And so she so I think she was able to see this and to realize that something was very wrong if this was happening. I don't think she comments on it. I don't think she has a moral feeling about it,
Mm-hmm.
but I think I think it's important to understand that comment that she makes in the larger context of her awareness and her study of reproduction as a scientist, as someone who has this interest in it. And I think it's an important way. I juxtapose her in that work to the Vermeer women, and that I think it's central to understand again how these two worlds of women were completely interconnected.
But do you think that she's also using nature as a way to justify a natural order of things in which?
No,
No.
actually,
Okay.
I think she actually is calling it out as unnatural.
Mm.
I think that's part of why she puts it in there, is she recognizes that it's unnatural. And she actually, unlike many of her male counterparts in this period, many of her male counterpart kind of natural historians, which is what people would call them, they all believed in the harmony of nature and the harmony of the cosmos, and this idea that, you know, everything was in balance and and her work really doesn't argue this. In fact, if anything, her work is often about kind of the disharmony of nature. And her work really focuses on moments within the insect and animal and human realms in which nature is out of alignment. And that's that, to me, that's actually what makes her work really interesting, is that unlike a lot of her male counterparts who are pretty convinced that there's a pretty harmonious natural world order, she's not quite so convinced.
I want to talk a little bit about the absence of, you talk a lot in the book about an absent other, an absent husband, or an absent depiction
Yeah.
of what's happening really in the world around
Yeah.
slavery. And there is a there's a painting that I would actually, can we bring up the slide? What I find always interesting about this this painting is that we really do this. We really go right to the center of, we see Actaeon here, who has walked into this very private moment between these women. And really, at its edge is this enslaved woman coming to the rescue of this situation, of this dilemma. And when I was at the Gardner, I commissioned Claudia Rankin to write a poem about her. I think many people came into the exhibition, and I was never convinced that anyone could see her,
Yeah.
or that she was worth having a conversation about. And I spent a lot of time with this painting and in the gallery just listening
Yeah.
to what people would say about it. And very rarely, if ever, did I hear anyone speak about her. And this had a very profound effect on me. So,
Yeah.
this is Claudia Rankine's poem, Among the Undressed. Stepping into the painting, backing up for a moment to its edge, any further we'd fall out of the picture, we encounter her. Black woman, be she enslaved or what? Of all the women here, she alone dressed in white and orange stripes, partially draped, in full consciousness of her object, the chaste goddess, yet and always still naked in the structures of thought that fix us. We see her clothing, the chaste goddess, or since we might as well embrace the goddess's outside mythic powers, I would go so far as to say we see her shielding the metaphorically winged goddess, who, despite her proximate fleshy positioning, dominates in the crash between gods and mortals. We see her, be she enslaved or what, her dress slipping, rushed into service, her gaze caught by Actaeon, who stands before her caught in the myth. Dear, dear Actaeon, you have stumbled into that which you created, your pillaging glance. You have stumbled into, we must be careful here not to understate the violence you are, white and male. You have stumbled into the painted poem lit from the left. Try to see yourself. Throw your reflection back through the impoverishment of history. Under these circumstances, given our circumstances, Actaeon, whatever you might think of your coming state, your bullish metamorphosis, stag, does not destroy your authority, your potential power to come furiously. It is, after all, your dogs who ultimately destroy you. Whether we are addressing you, Actaeon, or not, the goddess knows. She knows. And as clearly as anyone before or since, the Black woman, be she enslaved or what, sees. She sees, has seen, has learned, has lived our collective history of being raped, whether we are approached by you, Actaeon, or not. Between the goddess and her nymphs bathing in the sacred grotto lives the premise of chastity, even as the nymphs flirt in their eloquent poses. I do not doubt that we must have refinement, or is it confinement, in the picture at the same time that we recognize that history has made peace with. This classical representation, the displacement of a vagina by a face, remains living as far as we, the Black woman, be she enslaved or what, can see. And is it that only one face reflects back to us what a human being is not? In x rays of the painting, layers of light reveal the Black woman, be she enslaved or what, naked or otherwise, is not original to the picture, but rather arrived as a substitute shade onto the body of a white woman in an effort perhaps to normalize unthinkable acts, unspeakable practices. Why is the dog there at the feet of the Black woman, be she enslaved or what? Oh, Titian, Titian. The women cannot truly merge, not even here in your depiction of the moment of passage between the human and the non human world. I don't wish to be unfair. I am interested primarily in life, living, barely registered, rarely measured, regarding the Black woman, be she enslaved or what, be she x-rayed or not. I believe that you who see understand what I am describing, as certain dynamics are by no means limited to Titian's 16th century rendering. I do not think I exaggerate the living conditions out of which our being becomes our seeing. All this nakedness stuns in its ritual repetition of loss, loss of control over beauty, our bodies, all this nakedness. Under these conditions of seeing, The fact that the Black woman be I enslaved or what appears dressed undresses me. The fact that Titian addresses me does not redress me. The painting draws from what violence Titian allowed himself to see, thus fating us all to be seen seeing. See? It is no use trying to erase the violence in the painting. No use trying to disprove it is what it is. It is. But I give you this. Given the violence insinuates itself quite differently depending on who sees. Go and say what you have seen, if you can. Ooh. Is there, I mean, I think this poem has so much to do with what you are working on and studying. And I just would love to have a bit of a response from you to it.
Yeah, we know. So you definitely gave me a heads up about the poem. Uh, and but I realized when I was just listening to you read it and looking at the painting, what I hadn't thought before, um, is that in this scene the scene that is all about seeing, the scene that is all about Actaeon seeing something that he should not have seen, and therefore paying the price of it with his life and metamorphosis, uh, is what is actually so fascinating in it that Claudia Rankine points out is that the only person in the painting who sees is the Black woman on right there. And I'd actually never realized that about the composition, that the ways in which everyone is put together for this scene that's about seeing. We don't actually see Actaeon see the bathers. uh you know, she is herself covered by her veil, the goddess, and with the one woman peeks out from behind the pillar, perhaps, but really the only person who actually sees in this scene that is about the violence of vision is the woman, enslaved or not. And uh it's frankly such a brilliant observation. I don't know if I have much to add to that. But it is fascinating. It is fascinating. And I do think that there is a way in which and I don't really want to make a general history of Western European painting now and Black figures within it, because there's been many written, and I purposely did not want to do that in this book. But many people have pointed out, and in the conclusion, I do discuss this little Rembrandt print of the scene of execution of John the Baptist, in which the one person who really sees the scene is this young Black child, who's holding the patter for John the Baptist's head. And this print was central to Regal and kind of a very famous interpretation of such painting that he made. But the only person who's ever noticed the centrality of this figure to Regal was Derek Walcott. Um, so there is, and I don't know why this constantly reappears throughout painting, this idea that painters are depending on a category of racialization to make visible that which otherwise is too painful to behold. What do you think, Helga?
what happens in my brain is trying to relate this to then what comes after in abstract and contemporary art,
Hmm.
where we aren't really dealing with race unless the author of the painting is Black or whatever
No.
they are. And so I think a lot about, and in reading your book, I thought a lot about how we get from that unseen to this unseen.
Yeah.
I'm not helping any, I know.
No. It's a great question. No, no, I mean, what one thing that did, again, it was something that struck me after I finished my book. One of the things that I lay out in my book and is that um and this doesn't fully get where you're going, but I did think about how in the time period that I'm writing about, the category of race as we might think about it today is kind of in its making. Um and that really for a long period in Western European painting, the quote unquote other that was depicted was is about class. It was really about class. It was about peasants, and it was feudal society, and and it was really an engagement with othering within class. And and obviously that continues, but there is a way in which the identification of one's skin starts to take the place of class in painting, I think, as a mode by which to think about a bifurcation of self and other. And that transition, I think, happens in the 17th and 18th centuries, while there are still many problematic representations of class. Um, so it definitely doesn't get to your statement, but it is to say that I think it becomes an evidential way for people to enter into a painting and think that they know what it's about. And I think it becomes a way to not be in the messiness of what art often offers,
Mm.
which is the complexity of existence, which can rarely be singled down to identification.
What do you hope happens with the book outside the academy?
I don't know. I don't think I realized until my dad told me that he tried to read the introduction and conclusion and found it quite dense. I I think that I thought I wrote a very accessible book.
I think you did. I'm going to talk to you, Dad.
um so and I honestly I'm gonna tell a story that's a byway, but I wrote an article a long time ago when I was at graduate school called "Standing Mountains Move Like Clouds." And it's about Dutch landscape painting and this idea of inertia. And I quoted this line from a 17th century Dutch poem. Well, it turns out that that poem is actually that line is also actually a line in the Quran. And my most read article to this day is that article. And to this day, I've published a fair amount now in my career. The thing that I get the most emails about is that article by scholars of the Quran who really just want to say, I think it's really cool that this article relates to my interests, and how wonderful to think about Dutch painting in relationship to the Quran. And it's always very generous and generative and lovely. And I just share that story just to say, I feel like once you put something into the world, who knows? Who knows?
Even as it relates to this painting or in reading your book, uh, I feel that even if we're willing to look, it doesn't make it any easier to see.
Yeah.
And so, my hope, I don't know.
I don't know. I think I would like. I think it would be. I mean, one of the most controversial parts of my book, which I wasn't expecting, was the way that I use poetry, and I didn't expect that. It seemed very natural to me. And so I hope that, I mean, one very basic kind of methodological thing is I hope that poets can be considered on the same par as theorists and philosophers, because I think someone like Lucille Clifton is a philosopher. Um, but but the other thing is I would just like to stop thinking about art in terms of identity and direct representation of identity. And I would like it if it could be understood more as an intertangled web. And what was central to me in writing this book, and my editor really wanted me to have this subtitle, which I can't even quite remember because it was so verbose, and I just kind of said okay, and then the marketing team at Duke came in and said absolutely not, and I was like, my God. But it was something like slavery and the invention of Dutch art, colon, and like the art market and the rise of the bourgeoisie, and blah blah blah, and and actually my friend Emmeline in the audience was like no, um but I do uh I think our world is born of that world, and I think so many of our mythologies about what it means to consume, about the art market, about what it means for a painting to be thought of as a commodity that accrues value that you can hold like you might a stock. Um, the idea of the right to authorship and the property of one's person. The idea of nature as something that can be collected and pictured. Um, the idea of secularism itself. All of this emerged in the same period of the transatlantic slave trade, and to me these are inseparable. That these are our world is born from this, and to create another world, we have to sit in this one for a little while.
This is Caroline Fowler, Slavery and the Invention of Dutch Art. Thank you all so much for
Thank
coming
you.
out.